welcome Chair Hansen to the committee. And Representative Hansen, we did hear an overview already from Ms. Randall. So that's been taken care of. And I will just move to lay House File 131 over for possible inclusion in a future bill concerning MNLARS or transportation finance bill. We're at this point holding the MNLARS bills in our committee, and we'll take action once we're clear on other needs. And I know you have a bill that we'll likely hear next week as well. So welcome to the committee, and we'd like to hear from Representative Hansen on House File 131.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, and I apologize I was tied up across the hallway there. And I understand you've heard from the legislative auditor, and the rationale for the bill came, I believe, from the Audit Commission report last fall and the quarterly oversight committee meetings where Representative Torkelson and yourself as chair were at that. So there were folks who the audit, as you've heard, paid too much. And what we're trying to do is correct that problem with House File 131. I don't know if you've had testimony from DPS, but I think they will say that they are going to have difficulties determining that. I do have an author's amendment, the A2 amendment, I believe, which is the one to bring it up to concurrent dates. I actually had the bill drafted last fall and jacketed last fall.
Well, Representative Hansen was moving quickly on this.
I had it done in October, and I found that this is a bill that people are very interested in. Wherever they live, they want to make sure that they're back. If they paid too much, that they would get a reimbursement. So if you could adopt the A2 amendment, that would be great.
Thank you, Representative Hansen. Discussion of the A2 amendment. This is just an author's amendment to get the bill in the shape that Representative Hansen would like us to consider it in. Yes, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see in the A2 amendment on lines 1.9 and 1.10 that there are two blank appropriation numbers. Are we going to fill those in now or at a future date?
Representative Nelson, we will fill those in at a future date. We don't have a fiscal note for this bill, and it will be, I think, a challenge to make some calculations. But there's probably a series of bills that the legislature will need to make some appropriations on related to MNLARS, and so I think that would be part of the grouping. And also, just to ground members, if you have your audit report on page 50, bullet point number 6 is a recommendation from the legislative auditor. DPS and legislature should consider reimbursing customers where known errant collections were made. And so I think Representative Hansen's bill addresses that. And so the question, Representative Nelson, is figuring out what those reimbursements are. Representative Nelson.
Mr. Chair, as I look at this and I read it, again, we're actually putting a dollar amount into the bill. There were the blank part on the bill. We're putting a dollar amount in there.
Yep.
I read it backwards.
Yes, Mr. Chair. The A2 amendment, I estimated $2 million and 10% for the administrative costs, just as a ballpark figure. So that's you can change that in the future. I thought it might be good to have something to start with.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Representative Nelson. Again, this will require a fiscal note. This is a fiscal guess, but a fiscal note would be forthcoming, and that's one of the reasons we're holding this in committee. And the second reason we're holding it in committee is that I think we kind of want to get a sense of the broader situation with MNLARS. There's deputy registrar reimbursements, possibly towers, possibly auto dealers, possibly and likely an allocation to DPS and Minute for their needs moving forward. So there's a variety of fiscal matters concerning MNLARS. But, Representative Hansen, I respect your judgment here, and in terms of at least putting in these numbers. It does help give us a baseline. So that's where we're going here. All right. All in favor of the A2 amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, the motion prevails. And Representative Hansen, to your bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the bill as amended. We're dealing with vehicle registration transaction data. You heard from the legislative auditor, the materials there. We're directing the DPS to work on record keeping, submit a summary of data to the steering committee, have public outreach about the call center, you know, if people are interested in checking on whether they repaid or paid too much or not, and then calculating out that each of those tasks are significant. But I think if we inform folks, often the story flares back up in the media whenever there's a story about this, and there will be another audit coming up, and I think Minnesotans are going to ask, did I pay too much? And then the question is, if I paid too much, will I be getting that back? So that's where a little summary of the bill.
Okay, questions of the author? Representative Petersburg.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And the question is, does this bill have any place in it the fact that once it was recalculated, oftentimes it gets put into the system at that rate from moving forward? Is there a place in here where MNLARS is then also supposed to go back and correct the proper value for these vehicles so that it is correct from this point forward?
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Petersburg. As you know, correcting the live system has been a challenge. And I think that would be something we would hope that it would be corrected. And I think the fiscal note should take that into account. But that's probably the bill next week that we're going to hear as operations continue to evolve on MNLARS. But the logical question is, there should be my intent here is this is a one-time correction, and that system is correct so it doesn't keep making the mistake when you renew that.
Representative Petersburg.
Yeah, thank you. I just, what triggered my memory was Ms. Randall said that once your value was put in, the system keeps you from paying more tax the following year than it did before, which indicates that the system has kind of a memory into that. And I just want to make sure that when we do these one-time corrections, that we're also correcting the system so that the miscalculation doesn't occur in the future, even though we've corrected it in the past. And that's
Thank you, Representative Petersburg. Representative O'Driscoll. And
Thank
then
you,
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Hansen, I don't know if you have the answer to this question, but the current line of questioning and discussion by the committee gives me pause to ask this question. Will the overpayment of fees go to the payor, or will it go to the person who's entitled in the vehicle at the time that the tabs are issued for renewal for the next cycle?
Representative Hansen.
Mr. Chair and Representative O'Driscoll, I don't have an answer to that right now. Obviously, things move, so I think my intent would be the person who's made that payment at that moment, that transaction, that we're correcting that transaction. Now, I may have done that on December 31st and then sold you the car a month later, but the correction, that would be a different, so when you're keeping the contemporaneous record of the transactions, if that transaction was off, then that's between you and the MNLARS. That would be the second correction, if that's what I'm interpreting your.
Representative O'Driscoll.
It's not a two trains leave a station kind of question. Where do they meet? Where do they pass? From algebra class, it's just something that I realize we're trying to get it back to the taxpayer, to the consumer, which is the right thing to do on that. But it becomes a question of who's entitled in the vehicle, and we're probably not talking about hundreds of dollars on a vehicle. We're probably talking about dollars or tens of dollars, maybe on the high side on it. Just kind of curious to see how that's going to be addressed. I suspect consumers are going to have a question about, is it me who's entitled in the vehicle at that point, because we're just going to do the correction and reduce tabs the next year, or are we actually going to go through a bureaucratic issuing of checks and those kinds of things, or are we, as you suggested, we know there's a chain of who had that vehicle. Are we going to go back to that snapshot in time, who the payor was, and then issue them a check? I don't know if we have the answer. It's something that I think it probably needs to be fine-tuned and considered in your bill.
Thank you for those comments, Representative O'Driscoll. Representative Torkelson?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize we're just about out of time, and I know this bill is going to be discussed in more detail as we move through the process. We'll be informed by some more information that we're going to get. But just a quick question, Representative Hansen. Say that you are one of these people who paid too much, but you paid too much based on a base value that was too low. Are you going to accommodate that?
Representative Hansen, this is the, you're addressing the F-150 owners of the, across the state of Minnesota.
If you go to subdivision 3, Representative Torkelson, the Commissioner of Public Safety must establish a reimbursement calculation to refund or credit motor vehicle owners that overpaid the taxes and fees for the vehicle registration as identified by the analysis performed under subdivision 1. And we go back to that analysis. The Commissioner of Public Safety must compile and analyze all those transactions to determine the amount of actually paid by the owner for each transaction exceeded the amount required for the transaction. So if it's the amount required for the transaction and there was an error in that base value calculation, that should be taken into account because, again, you're back to exceed the amount required. So my intent there is required is what should be the actual amount with an accurate base value calculation.
Representative Torkelson?
Thank you. We may want to clarify the language, but if that's your intent, that's helpful.
Okay, we'll have time for one more question from Representative Hausman, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just more statement of anxiety about unintended consequences. When I've just been listening to the conversation today, including the earlier one about determining the value, and there's a part of me that wonders whether we're, without questions answered, whether we are handing an impossible task to the department. And on top of some of the other work that they are doing, I worry that we're going to bog them down in what is a very complicated and controversial potential.
Mr.
Representative
Chair,
Hansen.
Representative Hausman, I worry about that as well. I mean, this is, I've met with DPS, and I think that with this bill here, that this is not the end of this bill. The net goal here is to try to find some way of correcting an error for Minnesotans. And that after spending a year and a half on these MNLARS issues, I'm fully aware that it's a journey, that not a sprint, and that just when you think you're done with that journey, it continues. So I think this will continue. I'm happy to work with the committee and the agencies to try to find some way of helping Minnesotans who may have paid too much, and that we do that in an administratively easier way.
Thank you, and I do want to just thank you, Representative Hansen, for the work you've done, Representative Torkelson for the work that you've done and both of you continue to do on this issue. We have a lot of good experts in the room, and as well as the Department of Public Safety. So, you know, this is, as Representative Hansen said, the beginning of a conversation about this bill and what we can do for Minnesotans that felt that they were wrong through this process. And we will, and with that, I will renew the motion to lay this bill over for later discussion and possible inclusion in a future finance bill.